Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
What a great day to be alive, right, Jerry?
You bet.
we've got to show any day on this side of the grave is a phenomenal day. Well, that's all I can say. We have a great show lined up for our audience, but I just want to remind everybody that Beyond the Matrix is sponsored by TorahLearningChannel.com, and it's found on the internet, a great place for your Torah learning. I know a lot of people use it as sort of background lecture while they're doing their tasks during the day, but some of the greatest rabbis in the world in English and teaching some of the most phenomenal subject matters from Kabbalah to the Talmud to regular Torah portion learning, Jewish wisdom. You can't miss it. TorahLearningChannel.com. Jerry, we have a guest on today that's a normal guest that we've had on several times, but we're really excited because of the timely nature of this. Stan Lee's death is just, a week ago, something like that?
In fact, the very day that we were recording a program with our friend, Dr. Raphael Medoff of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, Stan Lee, the superhero of comics, was passed away at the age of 95.
And then all of a sudden, you and I found out something about Dr. Medoff that we didn't know. And this is really exciting because he's actually collaborated with Stan Lee. As a matter of fact, Stan Lee's last essay written, highlighted in the New York Times, I guess, I think it's New York Times, was in Medoff's book that is coming out that we're going to be talking about in the show. And maybe you could talk about the book for a brief moment.
The best comment about it is it's actually riveting. For those of us, and I'm not that young, who grew up as pre-teeners and teenagers consuming comic books like Captain Marvel and Captain America and Superman and Batman. It was a delight, basically, to go through this thing, admittedly about a horrible subject, but it also indicated the pioneering effort essentially of writers and cartoonists and creators like Stan Lee to get involved with important public issues.
And the power of illustration and comics for education. So we'll be right back. Don't go away. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
Not really. Stan had a pretty typical upbringing as a child of Jewish immigrants. He was raised in the Bronx. His parents had come from Romania. His father was involved in the garment industry. So, like, he had the upbringing that was typical of the American Jewish immigrant experience in the first half of the 20th century. But from what I know of him, he does not seem to have been very involved in Jewish community activities or any Jewish organizations.
You first worked with Stan Lee on a project for Disney. Tell us about that.
Well, some years ago, I had the interesting experience of collaborating with a prominent comic book artist by the name of Neil Adams on a comic strip about a woman who had been imprisoned in Auschwitz named Dina Babbitt, who was an illustrator and a painter. And in Auschwitz, she had been singled out by the infamous Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele, because he was looking for an artist among the Jewish prisoners who would do portraits of some of the Gypsy or Roma prisoners upon whom he was conducting experiments. Mengele felt that the photographic equipment that he had wasn't accurately capturing something in the skin tone of these prisoners. He was looking for something that would prove they were biologically inferior. So he decided he needed a portrait artist. Dina Babbitt, as a teenager, had been taken to Auschwitz along with her mother from their native Czechoslovakia. And in the children's barracks at Auschwitz, Dina began painting a huge portrait, a huge illustration of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That movie had just come out in Europe. She had seen it multiple times. It was fresh in her mind. And she thought it would be a way to soothe the children in the children's barracks of Auschwitz during their final hours. She was arrested by the Gestapo. They discovered what she was doing. But when they brought her to Mengele, she assumed she was going to be executed immediately for that offense of painting on the walls there. But instead, Mengele had found the artist he was looking for. And so he demanded that she begin painting some of these prisoners. She insisted, and it's remarkable when you think about a teenager trying to insist on anything in Auschwitz through Dr. Mengele. But she insisted that he spare her mother's life in exchange for her doing the paintings. And incredibly, Mengele agreed to that. And so Dina then began very slowly painting the portraits of these prisoners. And I say slowly because she knew that as long as she was painting, they were still alive.
Right.
She and her mother survived Auschwitz. Dina was still there doing these portraits when the Russians liberated the camp in January 1945. Mengele fled, of course, to South America. And all the paintings, as far as she knew, had disappeared. She assumed that he had taken them with him or destroyed them. But lo and behold, in 1973, out of the blue, Dina Babbitt, then living on the West Coast and working as an animator, by the way, for some of the most prominent animation studios and drawing characters like Captain Crunch and Wile E. Coyote and Daffy Duck. During those years when she was working as an animator, she suddenly received a phone call from a museum in Poland. It's called the Auschwitz State Museum. It was established on the grounds of what remained of Auschwitz. And they told her that they had come into possession of 8 paintings that were signed Dina 1944. Another remarkable aspect of the story that she signed the paintings. But they had been trying to find her, and lo and behold, they had tracked her down. And they invited her to come to Poland to verify that they were her paintings. She thought she was going to Poland to retrieve her property. When she arrived at the museum with a large suitcase suitable for carrying the artwork, she was shocked to discover that, in fact, they had no intention of returning the paintings to her. And then she began a long struggle over many years to try to pressure and persuade the museum to give her back her paintings. Now, what happened is, around 2006, my colleagues and I at the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies became aware of Dina Babbitt's struggle to get her artwork returned to her. And I had an idea that reached back to my own adolescence as a comic book fan. The idea was to contact the world-renowned comic book artist Neil Adams, because I remembered from when I was a kid that he had led an effort in the comics industry to convince the major publishers, Marvel and DC, to give back original artwork to the artists after the comic books were printed. The standard practice among all the comic book publishers had been to either destroy the original artwork or give it out as souvenirs when like a group of Boy Scouts would come and visit the Marvel studios, that sort of thing. And so Neil had led this effort to regain the original artwork. And so I went to him and told him the story of Dina Babbitt. And to make a long story short, he said, well, why don't we do a comic strip about Dina Babbitt's experience in Auschwitz and her struggle to regain her paintings? And because that was the way that Neil Adams knows best to communicate cause to the public. So we began working on that comic strip. And when it was finally published, and Marvel Comics, Stan Lee was the publisher of Marvel Comics eventually published that comic strip in an issue of X-Men one of among the many heroes that Stan created. And after the comic was published, Neil and I were contacted by Disney Educational Productions. Disney has an educational division. They create curriculum materials for schools. And they said they wanted to take our comic strip and make it into a kind of an animated feature known as a motion comic, and that they wanted to have Stan Lee as the narrator. And that is how I first became acquainted with Stan Lee and how we came to first work together.
Gee, that's amazing to have the coincidences of both your recollection and the fight for Dina Babbitt's portraits for the Dark Angel. That is something, by the way, that has never appeared in any of the history of regarding Stan Lee and the Holocaust, other than the stuff that you've got in this book that you've published along with Adams and others.
We also put together a mass petition signed by more than 400 comic book artists and writers in support of Dina Babbitt's struggle. Stan Lee was the lead signatory on that petition, which we then we sent to the Auschwitz Museum as one of our many efforts to try to publicize the cause and to try to convince them to give her back her paintings.
Rod?
Most people, including myself, really did not realize how influential Stan Lee was in all types of causes for justice and equality, and to sort of stand up for the small guy. I think that's what makes his superhero character so strong. And just recently, you said that aren't you listed as one of the last essays for your book was written by one of the last essays that Stan Lee wrote was for your book, correct?
Yes. Well, what happened is during this period when Neil Adams and I were working on that comic strip, and then when we began collaborating with Disney, Neil and I had the time to speak a lot about, to talk a lot about some of these issues. Neil himself is not Jewish, and this the whole question of Holocaust-related issues was new to him as well. And we began wondering to what extent comic books had been a medium for talking about the Holocaust back during the years before the Holocaust was widely taught in American schools, before there was a United States Holocaust Museum in Washington. Back in the day when people didn't talk about it too much, we wondered if maybe comic books were talking to American teenagers about a subject that was really not being widely discussed in American society.
Right.
And from that grew the idea that we should research this subject, and if there were, in fact, comic book stories that had been published, that perhaps there could be a book. And as we're working on it, at that point, I reached out to Stan Lee and asked him if he would consider writing the introduction for the book, and he immediately and graciously accepted. And he wrote the introduction way back at the very beginning when the book was still just in its earliest stages, and happily it saw light. It was published just in the last few months, and I'm very glad Stan saw it before he passed away.
We're going to have to go to a break. I really appreciate you bringing this up because I'm telling you, most people just have no clue of how involved Stan Lee was in so many of these causes. We're going to come back right after the break. You're listening to Beyond the Matrix here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
We are back from the break. Thank you so much for sticking around. My name is Rod Bryant. I've got Jerry Gordon and Raphael Madoff. We've been talking about, of all things, superhero comics, Stan Lee, and how did Raphael get involved with Stan Lee and Comic-Con, and such a serious Mensch here is now finding himself in front of crowds of hundreds of funny wearing costume people. And so we're going to kind of kick it right off with that. Jerry, you have a question you was going to ask.
I do. Raphael, how did the book We Spoke Out, Comic Books and the Holocaust, really get kickstarted. You talked about some of the antecedents for it, but how did it finally gel?
So my co-authors and I, Neil Adams and Craig Yo, began the long process of researching deep into comic book history, going back to the period right after World War II, to see if there had been any published comic book stories that dealt with the Holocaust. Now, during World War II itself, there were lots of comic book stories which had superheroes fighting the Nazis. And there are many famous issues, for example, Captain America, where you see Captain America punching Adolf Hitler in the nose. But those comic book stories did not deal with the question of Hitler's persecution, mass murder of the Jews. It's notably absent. There are patriotic stories, there are war stories, but they don't talk about the concentration camps, the death camps, the mass murder of the Jews. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, the late 1940s and early 1950s, we began to find some comic book stories that did, in fact, have the Holocaust as part of their theme. Now, I hasten to add, they were a mixed bag, the stories from the late 40s and early 50s, in this sense. Some of them were clearly about the Holocaust, but didn't mention the Jews. The prisoners in the camps would be shown without anything to identify them as Jews. They would be described as refugees or political prisoners or racial prisoners, but nothing specifically indicating that Hitler's main target were the Jews. And there was a reason for this. There was a mood in American society after the war that encouraged ethnic groups to play down their differences, to merge their particular identities in the broader American public. And so many American Jews felt uneasy about emphasizing their Jewishness. And this seems to have extended to some of the many Jewish comic book writers and artists, because some of those stories, not all of them, but some of them, they're obviously about the Holocaust. One is called Escape from Majdanek. So it's about an escape from a Nazi death camp, and yet the victims, the escapees, are not identified as Jews. What we found, though, is that began to change as we moved into the 1960s. We found comic book stories in which the Holocaust was part of the narrative, in which the Jews were clearly identified. And the later you go, the more explicit the comic book stories are about acknowledging that the victims were primarily Jews.
Was that triggered in part by the Eichmann trial in the early 60s, which went global?
That was probably one aspect of it, but in general, the 1960s were a time in American society when ethnicity was considered to be legitimate, and when all sorts of minority groups, other ethnic groups, aside from the Jews, began affirming their ethnic separatism. Those were the years, of course, of the rise of the Black Panthers. And among the Hispanics, there were the Young Lords, and there were militant ethnic groups that were very proud about asserting their identity, and Jews gradually began to find themselves more comfortable with identifying as Jews. One of the interesting, surprising things we found about the comic book stories that we were unearthing was that they were not in the type of comic books we expected. What I mean is this: there are superhero comics, and there are Western comics, cowboys and Indians, and there are war comics. And there's a whole line of comic books related to wars, and that's where we thought we would find stories that involve the Holocaust. That would be the natural place. You already had, in many of those stories, Americans fighting Germans, and they were in the areas where the death camps were. And we did find a number of stories in war comics, but we also began to find them in the mainstream superhero comics in the 70s. Batman, Captain America, the X-Men, Captain Marvel. And so our book, We Spoke Out, includes this interesting variety of stories where comic book creators, both in the war comics and in the superhero comics, began to touch on the issues related to the Holocaust, and this is a significant point, they were communicating to audiences, largely of American teenagers, who otherwise were not hearing about the Holocaust because it was not widely taught in the schools and was not part of the popular culture. And movies like Schindler's List didn't yet exist. Schindler's List came out in 1993. Mouse, the first famous graphic novel about the Holocaust, was also a product of the 90s. So back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, we concluded comic books were actually one of the ways in which young Americans were learning about genocide. And therefore, comics have played a surprisingly important role in American society that in general has not been understood or recognized.
There is a significant role of Jews in the comic book industry, and I find it interesting that you were talking about the artist that had really basically started after the Holocaust, going to the West Coast and become an illustrator. And we know Mel Blanc, very famous voiceover character for many of the cartoons that were on television, and from the early years all the way up to his death. What has been the role, the larger scope of the role of Jews in comic book industry?
Comic book writers and artists since the beginning of the comic book industry in the 1930s were very widely represented. Jews were very prominent in the industry from the beginning. The creators of Superman, Siegel and Schuster, were both Jewish. The creators of Batman and the Joker, Bob Kane and Jerry Robinson, and their collaborators were almost all Jews. In some ways, and Neil Adams likes to joke, he says comics were really a Jewish industry. Probably partly reflected the fact that it was hard for Jewish artists to break into many of the prominent advertising agencies and other places where artists frequently would be employed, but where there was some discrimination against Jews. That was probably part of the reason. Stan Lee, of course, was Jewish, and his brother Larry Lieber, who to this day is an artist on the Spider-Man series, were of course Jewish. People, by the way, often ask Stan about why he changed his name, and the assumption was that he was growing up in an era when many Jews did not want to be publicly identified as Jews, and so they changed their names out of embarrassment. But Stan said, and I believe him, he said he wasn't embarrassed about it being known that he was Jewish. He was embarrassed about people knowing that he was writing comic books. And I'm sure that was the case. In the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s, comic books were considered a very lowbrow form of entertainment. Most people considered them junk. Things have changed a lot, obviously. Today, the comic books, are the centerpiece of some of the biggest movies in Hollywood, and they become a part of the mainstream culture. But it wasn't that way back in Stan's early days, and therefore, being Stan Lee, sheltered him from the embarrassment he expected to experience if people knew that he was a comic book guy.
Raphael, talk about your rather interesting experience of attending later the so-called Comic Cons with these elaborate costumes of the superhero characters. And here you are, a Holocaust historian with these young kids and young adults in many cases. What was that like, and what did it really reflect?
Okay, well, first of all, it was like a homecoming for me because as a teenager, I had been a comic book fan. So when I stepped into the hall at the giant Comic-Con in San Diego for the first time, it was like going back to my own roots. It was a lot of fun. By the way, so the tremendous growth of these comic book conventions is another example of how comics have completely entered the mainstream. When I was a teenager in the 1970s, would go to comic book conventions, a big audience, a big crowd of attendees would be, 100 or 200 people, okay? Comic-Con in San Diego, it's only one of several that are around, many that are held around the country constantly. Comic-Con in San Diego now attracts something in the range of 150,000 people over a 5-day period every summer. And the one in New York Comic-Con is almost as big now. Anyway, so several years back when Stan Lee and Neil Adams and I were working on the project for Disney Educational Productions, we were invited to speak at the San Diego Comic-Con. And so I had the very interesting and unique experience of being the guy who got to sort of follow along in the shadow of these two of the greatest comic book creators of all time, Stan Lee and Neil Adams. And I remember just before the panel began, the three of us were stationed at a door just outside the hall. It was a door way in the back. So when the door opened, it was time to come in. We walked all the way from the back of this tremendous hall, all the way up to the dais. And we were, because it was so crowded, it was kind of, we were walking up single file. So Stan Lee first, then Neil Adams, and then me. And as we made this long trek from the back all the way to the front, the crowd erupted in this enormous standing ovation that continued during the whole part of that. So I was basking there. Obviously, they weren't clapping for me. Nobody knew who I was. But I got to walk along with Stan and Neil and enjoy that moment in the spotlight. Anyway, we had a very interesting panel. And aside from the fact that it was fun to do it, we had this very serious business of acquainting comic book fans with a part of their own history, their own industry's history that they had not known about.
We're going to pick it up after the break. Really appreciate you guys listening. Remember, we are sponsored by the Torah Learning Channel, TorahLearningChannel.com. We'll be back right after these messages.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in, because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
And we're back into the final segment. I'm Rod Bryant along with Jerry Gordon and Raphael Madoff, and we're talking about comic books in general. We just had spoken about the experience Raphael had at Comic-Con, and really seriously, let's talk about the overall impact of all things a comic book, an illustrated book, on education for the Holocaust. Can we talk about that for a little bit?
We want to communicate that history and the lessons from it to young people. We need avenues other than long, detailed history books with lots of footnotes. The visual images are much more impactful for young people, and so the Wyman Institute, of which I'm director, has made it a focus to promote the use of comic books, political cartoons, animation, and other graphic arts in communicating and teaching about the Holocaust to young people today.
I want to draw the viewers' attention that over the right shoulder of Dr. Medoff are two posters of a graphic novel that came out in the early 1990s called Mouse. It was a metaphor for the experience of the Holocaust. Subsequently, a couple of years after it came out, it received a Pulitzer Prize. Dr. Medoff, how important was Mouse as a breakaway educational tool about the Holocaust?
Well, Mouse was the very first graphic novel about the Holocaust. So Art Spiegelman, the writer and artist, was completely breaking new ground. And he chose a somewhat controversial method of representing the Jews, the victims, and the Germans, the perpetrators. Depicting the Jews as mice, that's where the title Mouse comes from, was something that many people were uneasy about. But it actually turned out to be a very effective way of communicating with young people. And of course, it subsequently won a Pulitzer Prize, and Mouse is today required reading in many, many schools around the country, because teachers quickly understood that students were much more likely to pay attention and to remember things that appeared in graphic and visual form rather than just ordinary text. The posters you see behind me are the Hebrew language posters for promoting the Israeli edition of Mouse. Mouse was so popular that it has appeared in many different languages in many different countries, including in Israel. Today, there are quite a few graphic novels about the Holocaust that are available. There are new ones coming out all the time, and they're very generally speaking, they're quite good. They're quite effective. And my own institute, the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, produces a line of educational comic books about different aspects of the Holocaust. So these are factual history, but just being taught through a different medium. And we find that the teachers appreciate these forms of education very greatly, and that it gets students thinking, it gets them talking, and most of all, it gets them to remember, which is crucial because we're obviously living in a generation that has not seen the last of genocide or other human rights violations. And we desperately want young people to be able to derive lessons from past historical experiences and not repeat the mistakes of previous generations in turning away from genocide.
Dr. Medoff, you have written this book, We Spoke Out. What is your overall expectation of the book? I mean, obviously you want to sell the book, but the idea, what are you trying to convey and teach? And we've talked about this large breadth of comic illustrations used to speak out. What are you wanting to accomplish and educate people on when they read this book?
Well, for many years, comic books were considered junk. They were not taken seriously as literature. They were pure entertainment for kids. And gradually, however, educators have come to realize that, in fact, comic books can be very, very powerful educational tools. And that's the ultimate purpose of a book like We Spoke Out, to show how comic strips can be used. Comic books, animation, political cartoons, how all these forms can be used to impart important lessons from history to the audience that really needs to hear them the most. Because today's high school juniors and seniors and college freshmen, they're going to be tomorrow's leaders. They're the ones who are going to be, the future leaders of American society and around the world. So they are the most important ones. They're the ones who need to learn about genocide and the dangers of the world turning a blind eye.
Dr. Raphael, you've been doing work in a related field, political cartoons from the 1930s and 1940s, and co-authored a book called Cartoonists Against the Holocaust. How does that differ from We Spoke Out?
Well, I mentioned before that comic books in the 1940s, like Captain America and Superman, didn't talk about the Holocaust. They didn't talk about what was happening in Europe at the time. Political cartoonists were different. The political cartoons that appear on the editorial pages of major American newspapers every day, those cartoonists did, from time to time, try to draw the American public's attention to the persecution of Jews in Nazi Germany and throughout Europe. So my book, Cartoonists Against the Holocaust, co-authored with Craig Yo, who was also one of the co-authors on We Spoke Out. Cartoonists Against the Holocaust features 140 political cartoons which appeared in newspapers at the time and tried to publicize things like the Kristallnacht pogrom, the voyage of the infamous refugee ship, the St. Louis, and other things that were happening at the time. So the political cartoonists in the 30s and 40s were among the small number of Americans who tried to speak out at a time when, unfortunately, most people were looking away and were not interested in talking about what was happening to the Jews in Europe.
How can our audience get a hold of your book, We Spoke Out? And it's already out and been published, correct?
Yes, We Spoke Out is available at a nice discount on Amazon. And Cartoonists Against the Holocaust also can be purchased through Amazon or through our website, wymaninstitute.org.
Now, once again, the audience may not be familiar because they're just hearing for the first time, but we only have just a few more minutes left. Could you talk about the Wyman Institute and how important it has been in this field of education?
The David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, based in Washington, D.C., is named after the most famous and highly regarded historian of America's response to the Holocaust. I'm not speaking about the Holocaust in general, but specifically America's response, how President Roosevelt and his administration responded to news of the mass killing, the response of the news media, of the American Jewish community, of American churches. That is the focus of the Wyman Institute's work, carrying on the legacy of Professor Wyman, whose book, The Abandonment of the Jews, published in 1984, remains the gold standard for this field. Professor Wyman passed away earlier this year, but his work, his research is carried on now by a new generation of younger scholars. And through the Wyman Institute, we conduct educational programming, research, publications, all focusing on America's response to the Holocaust through both traditional scholarship as well as innovative media such as comic books and political cartoons.
So does the Institute itself release educational material that a school can access?
Yes, we publish comic books that teachers use in schools. We distribute other kinds of educational materials that teachers find to be very effective, and they find that the students respond when they have that graphic or visual representation of historical issues, which otherwise, frankly, they're very distant, very remote from the average 16-year-old today, let's say. But when looking at a political cartoon or a comic book, then it's a whole different ballgame.
So it's wymaninstitute.org or com.com?
.org. Wyman, W-Y-M-A-N, institute.org.
Yeah, really be important for you to go, especially if you're an educator and you are looking for some innovative material to teach or to use to teach children. A fantastic site, wymaninstitute.org. And also, if you'd like to order the book, We Spoke Out, you can find it on Amazon. We Spoke Out in big, bold, red letters. You can't miss it when you type it in the search engine. Dr. Madoff, we really appreciate you coming on and educating us. This is something that you and I and Jerry have talked about over the last couple of months while you're in the process of wrapping up the book. But what an education to find out the power of comics to educate people. And, Jerry will remember back in our time in the Army, we had comic books to illustrate how to disassemble a weapon. And, I thought it was kind of silly, but now I realize these are 18-year-old kids that are in the Army. What a way to illustrate values and maintenance of a vehicle, et cetera, all taught with comic books. And I'm not sure, Jerry, they really produce those anymore, but they would probably be collectibles now, to say the least. So, Jerry, do you have anything else? We have about a minute and a half.
Dr. Madoff, given this program today and its revelations, it seems to me that Stan Lee, Adams, your other co-author, Mr. Yo, really did the field of Holocaust education a demonstrable service. Because without graphic depiction of what occurred during the Shoah to Jews, Roma, and other people, essentially teenagers throughout the world, not just the United States, would not really have an appreciation of how horrifying it was.
The most powerful witnesses to the Holocaust are the survivors themselves. But of course, with each passing day, we lose more and more of them. So educators need new ways to talk about these subjects, and comic books and animation, political cartoons are clearly one of the ways that they can use.
Well said. Well said. This has been the Beyond the Matrix show here on Israel News Talk Radio. We can't wait to see you next week. We'll see you then. Shalom.